I could not be more delighted than I am that we've got Thomas Keyes with us tonight for the latest in our irregular. I'm not sure you can call it a series exactly of online talks. The museum, we've been very privileged to be working with Thomas for quite a while now, collaborating on various things, exhibitions and so on. I find his work astonishing, his experimental research and his thinking and investigation of geometry and all sorts of things is absolutely fantastic. And I'm sure he'll mention it, but he has got a Kickstarter crowdfunding campaign going on at the moment to help to fund the next stage of his work. And we're going to hear about that tonight, making the Book of Kells. So without more ado, I shall hand over to Thomas.
That's right. Good. So tonight's talk is called Making the Book of Kells in the Highlands, based on my research of how to do this locally, and because there's evidence that that could be the case. Because I've got to get into an hour, I'll focus on bits that aren't really covered elsewhere, so there won't be a lot to do with knotwork, but there'll be quite a lot on parchment and materials and geometry, things that haven't really got sort of the full research elsewhere. So getting into parchment, this is obviously one of the issues you face making parchment in the Highlands is the variables, the temperature being one of them. So you can get down to -15 or on a good day plus 25. And that's one of the variables. It's probably not the worst. It's the easiest to mitigate depending on the techniques you're using. But it gives some insight as to why insular parchment is a pretty difficult thing to define and a difficult thing to describe, and pretty much anything you say about it comes with a caveat that there's probably a bit of parchment that contradicts what you've just said about it. That's just the nature of it. It's a very variable thing because of the conditions. So this is some things that are said about parchment, particularly the Irish attributed books. So some of it's suede-like, some of it has a burnished appearance. So those are two complete opposites, both true. White to dark brown. The one almost always true thing that I think can't be contradicted is that it's pretty much always calf. I can't think of an example of actual insular parchment that isn't calf. That's about the only simple thing you can say about it without a load of caveats and exceptions. That's probably it. There's many holes in it. They have lots of different reasons. They're quite often misidentified. Something that comes up quite a lot is the warble fly. That's definitely not the case. Warble fly wouldn't get into an animal and break through the back until it's about 8 months old, much older than suitable for parchment making from a calf. So that's not the case. That's usually a bacteria-based hole. There's things about technique as well. Split skins is an issue that gets mentioned now and then. I don't think that's possible either, especially not in calf, maybe in sheep. But for insular parchment, absolutely no evidence of it. But again, with parchment techniques, the descriptions are quite fast and loose with not a lot of research to back up what's said. One of the main variables and the most interesting for the north of Scotland is the access to limestone. So if you look at the map of the UK here, you can see that once you get north of the Antonine Wall into Pictish territory, you're pretty short of limestone. And this Jurassic limestone is very variable in quality. So even the meager amounts that are scattered about there, that's an exaggeration in what's actually accessible. This is mostly low quality. And if you look at the rough map of the Pictish kingdoms, I'm not too concerned about how accurate they are, but if you see that the main one, Fideck, where you would have both Rosemarkie and Tarbet, two major monastic sites, doesn't appear to have any access to its own limestone. So it's not too much of a stretch to suggest that from prehistoric times, for all hide tanning and any industrial process that needs an alkaline, they have to have sorted this out in a different way. It's just not feasible that you're moving vast quantities of limestone in for industrial purposes at this time. So if you don't have lime, your other option for an alkaline is seaweed. And this is very much what appears to be the case at Tarbet. So I've got a picture here. One of these is the lime burn. The other is a seaweed burn. And you can see from the photo two quite different things. With the seaweed, that actually suggests there's a lot less smoke than there actually is. There really is a lot of smoke with seaweed. It's a really dirty process, and you have to pile it on and pile it on constantly to get very little return. Whereas the lime, you just got to get a high temperature. You do have to add fuel, which does add a bit of work, but lime's pretty solid, shells are pretty solid. You get quite a good return for what you're doing. So the difference in return is quite noticeable. So here we have it. And again, these figures are a bit oversimplified, but in terms of existing research, that's what I've got to pull them from, that your return on limestone to get your hydrated lime for parchment would be a 74% return on the material. For soda ash from seaweed, it's 2.5%. Now, in reality, it's not as extreme as that because seaweed, dried seaweed, is its own fuel. So you can make the fire, keep adding it on. After you've got it started, you don't have a fuel cost, whereas with lime, you do. However, even with all the benefits and all those wrinkles taken out of it, it's probably at least 10 times more efficient to work with lime than seaweed. That's a bit of a problem because we've got a parchmentery in the far northeast of Scotland. Why would you build a parchmentery somewhere that's 10 times more inefficient than somewhere with limestone? That's quite a stretch. These are other alkaline options that have been mentioned. I've tried them. They're not very good. They sort of seem good on paper. Yes, there's calcium in bones. It's about 40%. But there's a lot of other stuff in bones as well. Collagen, gunk to get off them. It's quite inefficient, quite a lot of work, involves quite a lot of fuel. So I don't actually think the return on bones, you're not beating seaweed by much, if at all. Shells, again, it's been suggested for turbot because shells were found on site. It's even been suggested for winkles, which really doesn't make much sense when you take in the time it takes to collect them for the weight of return and the fact that you have to add fuel in on top of that. So I would say shells are actually less efficient than seaweed. So these are sort of red herrings that get into the debate because on paper it looks all right. In reality, the amount of hours you're putting in to get your return, they're way off. They're just not sensible. So here we've got an example of a folio from the Lindisfarne Gospels, which I've labelled as fresh lime. That shouldn't be a surprise. That's Lindisfarne is sitting right beside a big supply of fresh lime. Why would you make parchment any differently? It's an easy resource to access. It gives you a very consistent parchment. So Lindisfarne Gospels the whole way through, same colour, barely a hole in it. That's because they're relying on a process that doesn't let in any bacteria. So you're using the strength of the alkali to create the parchment. And for all the other types of holes that are mentioned, such as people would suggest that the animal being skinned causes holes in the skin, but that just isn't the case. There's nowhere you would cut to open an animal up that would affect an area you make parchment from. That just wouldn't happen. For bacterial, which is the seaweed-based parchment, I'm using the Book of Kells as an example because this is classic what you would expect from a bacterial process. So the color is quite irregular. So you can see this is a little more brown. That's because they're using the alkaline at a much weaker strength and they're using it to attract bacteria. And all these little pit marks that you can see throughout the page, that's the bacteria eating into the skin. So they're actually using the bacteria rather than the alkali to eat into the skin to get rid of the bits you don't want. So this is it, close up, the Kells bacterial process. On the left of the screen, you can see one that's just about right. And on the right of the screen, you can see one that's gone a wee bit too far. Now, the difference between those two skins in processing time was about 20 minutes. They came out of the same vat, went on a different frame, one after the other, and that's my misjudgment in timing. That's what happened. And I still have that problem. I can't control this process in any accurate way, which suggests that the way they did the Book of Kells, they risked, almost 200 hides in that book. They really knew what they were doing, or their reject pile would have been uneconomic, to put it mildly. This is that close up. So this is the bacterial process kind of arrested as it happens. And what you can see around the outer side of the skin, this browner layer, that's the grain. That's where the hair would be sticking on. And the bacteria basically eat that layer away. So this creates a really, really smooth parchment underneath, like an incredibly smooth surface that you couldn't actually get from tools. And that's why the Book of Kells is described as burnished in appearance. Now, if you actually burnished parchment, you would probably give it quite a cockled appearance. That's not the type of pressure or action on parchment that's a good thing to do. If you did it against a surface, it's going to leave marks because the parchment's going to move up and down. If you did it on the frame, it's just not quite the right pressure. So I don't really think you can burnish parchment, whereas these bacteria create an effect that could be described as a burnished appearance. So I'm pretty sure that's what they're doing in Kells, and also that all these little pockmark holes, again, that's what's happening in Kells. Now, this hide is one that's got a lot of warblefly scars in it. So this is what you don't see in any medieval, well, in any insular manuscript, and I can't think of an example in later manuscripts either. It's also got a bruise right in the middle, which is another thing you don't really see. So it not only suggests that very young animals are being used, but also that they're being quite well cared for, because things like bruising and scarring, that all shows up in the corium layer of the skin that you use for parchment. So all of the animals used in insular parchment are being very cleanly butchered, very well skinned, and in their very short lives were pretty well treated. These are animals that are in good condition. Now, the only use of warblefly is in this scenario where it's actually very difficult on a screen to identify where the spine of an animal is. But when looking at the Book of Kells, it's quite important. So the blue arrow shows the direction of the spine through the middle of the animal, and you can see the scarring either side. And that's just because that's where the warblefly like to dig out to make a little air hole so they can breathe. They start off as eggs on the legs, they burrow under the skin, takes them a few months to get up, and this is just before they pop out. But for our purposes, it highlights where the spine is. And you can see why I needed to have that slide now when you try to see the spine in the Book of Kells, because it's very, very difficult to do on screen. So in folio 280, it's horizontal along the top, and in folio 28, it's vertically through the middle. That's one's a little easier to see. And Book of Kells gets criticised here as if this was somehow haphazard, as if the artists just didn't really care. They'll just throw in a skin any old way. That's not really the case. This is actually very carefully considered, and it's a consequence of the bacterial process of parchment making. And in its simplest terms, this is why. If you make parchment using the bacterial process, you're going to have holes in the skin, and you've got to avoid those holes to get the best use of parchment. So even though there's only a couple of holes in this skin, I've still had to change around where the folios get cut from just to get the most efficient use of the parchment. And essentially in all Irish books where they're accused of not caring what way around the skin goes, that's the reason why. It's just to avoid holes, whereas a book such as the Lindisfarne Gospels has got the spine down the middle the whole way through on the back of the book, and that's because they're using fresh lime, so they're not dealing with these holes. So in this folio on Kells, what I've done is highlight 9 of the holes. Now, that's not all the holes on this page. There's a few more I can see, and there's probably more on top of that because it's quite difficult digitally to get them all. But these 9 all dictate where the text has to go. So on blind chance, if this scribe had just been handed a piece of parchment with all these holes in it and then decided to start writing, the chance of not hitting any of those 9 holes, you'd have to be very, very lucky. So what this does is it puts the cutting of the hide and the scribe very close together. So the Book of Kells is not made by somebody who's outsourcing their parchment or even traveling any great distance. They are near a parchmentary. They're seeing bacterially processed hides on a hearse, and they've got the page they want to make, and they're deciding what cut to make to avoid those holes and hide these holes. And for the Book of Kells, this isn't even a particularly extreme example. There's many, many pages where they're skillfully avoiding holes to the point that you really, really have to look to find them. Now, if you hit one of those holes with the quill, that's going to kick out, and that's going to send a splatter of ink across your parchment, and then you're going to have to scrape that back with a knife. And whereas you can, to an extent, get rid of mistakes like that with a knife, it furs up the surface of the parchment, and that later attracts dirt. So although it's possible, technically, to erase mistakes, in a book that's 1,200 years old that's had a lot of people handling it, you're going to see them, and they're just not there in the Book of Kells. And that can only be because they're taking really, really careful consideration, and they're really, really close to the parchment making process to make sure that they are picking the exact hide they want for the exact piece of text or artwork they want to put on it, and making sure they avoid those holes. So that puts the artists of Kells and the parchment makers very close together, if not indeed the same people. It's a very, very close relationship. So here's the geology of Ireland, and I've marked on Kells. Now, as you can see from the labels of the different stone types, Kells sits in a pretty good limestone area, and it's 45 miles from the coast. So the chances that they were making bacterial parchment from seaweed there is fairly minimal. But you can't completely exclude the bacterial technique because you could do it with lime if you wanted. But it's higher risk for a lower return, so it's difficult to understand what the motivation for that would be. And if the Book of Kells was, say, started on Iona, then moved to Kells, you would expect there to be a break in the parchment that would demonstrate the different techniques based on geography. And of course, that is not the case. So the next place we have to look at is obviously Iona. And on first glance, if you look at Iona, it's not got any limestone. It's an island. It's got lots of seaweed. So it's a real contender for the bacterial process through seaweed. However, just looking at the geological map, there's where I've marked with an arrow this little island, Inchkenneth, which is basically a massive outcrop of limestone. And from checking it out further, it's very easily accessible, high-quality limestone, which obviously brings up the question, who's Kenneth and when did he get it? And it turns out that Kenneth is one of Columba's best mates, who went over with him and was straight out there pretty much not long after Iona was set up. And just looking at it from a parchment maker's point of view, if you were given the island of Iona to go and set up a monastery, one of the first things you would do, coming from Ireland, from a culture mainly based on limestone-based parchment, is to go and find your nearest source of limestone and secure it. And it would take a bit more research to sort of flesh out the bones on this theory, but it's not too much of pushing it out too far to suggest that that may be what they've done. And the research question now would be, is it more efficient for people in Iona to make their parchment on Inchkenneth and go back again, or is it more efficient for them to use seaweed? And the research just hasn't been done on this, but it's a close call. However, I have an inkling that if you had Inchkenneth in part of your estate, you would probably just make your parchment there because it would take out a lot of the risks of the bacterial process. So we'll move on to Tarbet now specifically. So these are the tools found at Tarbet. Firstly, we've got the pumice scrapers. That's for the final sheening. And again, those smooth pebbles. This is all for the smoothing of the parchment on the frame. The very small pebbles are for tying it on with strings to the hearse. The little blade is the famous lunellum, which is a bit of an issue. I shall get on to in a minute. The pins, quite possibly for stringing through or sewing up holes in the hide, not 100% sure. Pins are not a regular part of my practice. They're not something you would regularly need for the way I've been copying this, so I'm not 100% sure where they fit in the kit. The bone pegs, quite sensible for the technique, but you'd go through quite a lot of them because the bone it has to have the tension on it at a particular weak point, so they snap. So both these pegs are broken. That's what you'd expect from regular use. Now, as you can see from the little bit of marginalia there with the wee guy making some parchment, even though there's a lot of scale issues here, his lunellum's pretty much on for what you'd expect. And as we'll show you in a wee second, the Tarbet one is a bit of a problem. Now, that big semicircle that I've drawn out in red, that's the size of a normal lunellum. That is what you would expect. That is what you would hit the skin with. That's what the monk was holding in the picture. And in the middle of that is the Tarbet lunellum, which obviously is a little bit different. Now, if you hit the Tarbet lunellum on a skin, this hole here is what happens. In fact, it takes quite a lot of practice for that not to happen. And you can see here in the Book of Kells, it's happened. That's a hole in the Book of Kells. The first picture is the one I just showed previously. That's the hole I made. Now, that hole has bits of parchment sticking out. This is because it had already been tensioned and dried to quite an extent, so there's not much stretch left in it. So when the linellum went through, it makes the parchment kick out a bit on where the hole's been made. So on the far right, the picture shows where I've cut those bits of parchment back to give a flatter surface, so that would still be more suitable for a page. And that's where you can see the real similarity between the hole in Kells and the hole I've made. Because in Kells, the reason why they've trimmed back the edges of this hole is because it's the same type of hole, and they've had to do that so the page will lie flat. So this doesn't happen often in Kells, but it does happen, but it's a very, very distinctive mark of the tool that is a very small linellum, which has only been found at Tarbet. This is another hole you get, the Tarbet linellum, and this is when the skin's a bit wetter. So this is probably when the skin's on its first stretch and is going towards dry, and you're scraping off the grain layer, and you press it a bit too far. It happens. And the hole starts to close in because there's still tension on the frame, and the collagen fibers are still moving. So they pull it into this more elongated, quite distinctive, long, straight shape, and it starts to close over to an extent and just leaves a longer, straighter line. So if you haven't got any of the parchment dry yet, you can actually retension and reduce the size of that hole. And I expect that's what they've done here. So there's one from the Book of Kells and 3 examples of how I've done it. And you can see the similarity. You can see there's a real pattern in this type of hole from this type of linellum. And this is an example of the pegs. One, as found in Tarbet, a bone peg, and the other, what everybody thought pegs were before Tarbet, which is wooden pegs. And you see here, this is them both together. Straight up, it's the wooden peg that seems more sensible. They're much faster to make. They're much stronger. They're much more durable. They're much easier access. You only get 2 bones on a cow you can actually make the pegs out of, whereas the pegs made from wood, just from hedge laying, coppicing, these little forked points of hardwood and fruitwood, you'd be throwing those up all the time. They're practically firewood quality. So the only way that the bone peg becomes sensible is if you get the frame they're in completely soaking, at which point the wooden peg expands and you can't get it out. Hence the picture on the right. This is that sample of a frame being soaked, and now the wooden pegs get stuck, but you can still move the bone peg. So what that tells you about the Tarbet process is that the hearse gets really, really wet after it's gone. The skin gets really, really wet after it's gone onto the hearse. And that's not usual. You would maybe dampen a hide at the end to make it smoother. You might do little bits of retensioning involved re-wetting, but this level of soaking to the point that the whole wooden frame is completely soaked, that's unusual. So there has to be a reason for that, because they've gone to a lot of effort. It's many, many times more effort to make bone pegs, which break faster, than it is to make wooden pegs. So this is what I think this process is in action. This is it working, and you can probably tell why mistakes are made given the force used. I'll just do a short video clip of that now. So this is the grain layer being scraped off, a bit like a wallpaper scraper, which is not how you would normally use linellum. And that's the entire grain layer coming off in one go. If I was to do this demonstration of the abrasion technique of parchment making, we'd all be here for the rest of the evening to watch that same surface area be cleared very, very slowly. It really is an all-day activity. Whereas this, average size calfskin, half a day and you're done, easily. So it increases your efficiency by 2 to 3 times minimum. If I was better at it, it would probably be more than that again. So that's parchment covered for now. So we'll move on to pigments. I will probably, because of time, have to leave a few out, so we'll just concentrate on the more interesting ones. So the first one, the yellow, that's orpiment. That has to be an import because the nearest natural source for it is in Spain. So there's not really much to say about it other than they had a trade route and they got it in. The blue, that's woad, very easy to grow locally. So I'm quite sure that's what they did. The rock in the top right corner, that is iron pyrite, and that's been soaked in rainwater, and that causes it to be broken down by extremophile bacteria that live inside the rock and create these little crystals on top. And these crystals are the iron salt that you mix with the tannin to make what's sometimes called oak gall ink, but we'll get onto that again. I don't think it is. In the bottom left-hand corner, this is verdigris, so nominally copper with vinegar. although there isn't an exact recipe for this period, and chemically this is probably quite close to what it is. I had to use distilled vinegar to get that hue of it, and we just don't know quite how they did it. It's something that needs more research, but it's close. The white is gypsum. No gypsum in Scotland, but easy to move, and you only need very small quantities. And again, not quite clear why they liked it, because it doesn't handle that well. It's not a particularly pleasant paint to use, and the other whites are available. The red with a little bit of white here, this is lead tetroxide with its white lead carbonate beside it. They probably made it themselves locally. Lots of Roman lead about, even if they weren't mining it, and you need very, very tiny amounts to make a manuscript effectively. The purple, this is from the cudbear lichen. So this would have to be soaked in ammonia for about 3 to 4 months. And it makes this really, really deep purple. And it's also a universal indicator. So you can add various acids or alkali and get a full range of pinks to indigos with it. So it's really handy on that. And once they discovered that and adapted it to manuscript use, is quite popular. So this is one of the problems, even when you've got an exact ingredient. So research was done at Trinity in, I think, 2005, 2006. They analysed the Book of Kells. They got most of the results from most of the pigments and came up with great answers such as the blue is woad, not lapis lazuli, which it was previously thought to be. But even when you've got the exact answer, here presented is 48 perfectly sensible versions of that answer. And you could times that by 10 easily. If I look at one of the binders is cherry gum. That changes throughout the season. You get gradually more tannins in it. So you could have 10 different cherry gums. Egg glare, how rotten is the egg glare? Again, you could do it at 10 different times. Down the side, you've got the various things it was done with. So gypsum, burnt oyster shell, and hydrated lime, both raw and then cooked together. You could keep adding on various processes. So this thing that exists is a very close answer to the question, the sentence, the Book of Kells has woad in it. This is 48 interpretations. You could go on and on and on. So there's none of these are as settled as they would appear to be. So this is what I think the method is for the Book of Kells. So the sample here is that's pure woad, and that's woad mixed with gypsum without heat. My computer screen actually makes these look better than they actually are. They're both quite dull and grainy in real life and don't handle particularly well, and they certainly don't match the quality found in the Book of Kells. But I think the process for the Book of Kells is this. So this is heating some gypsum with some woad. Again, the woad just grows locally. It's a really easy extraction from the plant. You don't get much from a plant, but you don't need very much. So the reason I'm heating it with the gypsum is an idea I got from some research into Mayan blue, which has recently been, the technique for which has recently been rediscovered. So they were heating a type of clay with their local indigo plant, and they were essentially driving off a water molecule on the clay, which made, when heated, the gas of the indigo fix to where that water molecule was. So essentially creating a synthetic pigment. Hence why when they dig up archaeology of Mayan temples and things, every now and then you get surviving blue, because it's no longer an organic pigment that rots, it's a synthetic pigment. So move on to the example. So one of these is the Book of Kells. One of these is my attempt at the Book of Kells. It should be obvious enough which one's which. And important for our purposes here is the range of tones within the blue. So from the original, it's had a bit of a kicking on all of the colours, and it wasn't really clear whether the blue was like this because of age, because of deterioration, because somebody's had a little go at a repaint maybe. But when I tried it, and you can only make this type of blue in very small batches, what became apparent was that it's incredibly difficult to control the ratios accurately. So you're probably using less than 0.1 of a gram of woad to half a gram of gypsum. That's not measurable by any medieval standards. You really are doing it by eye and doing your best guess, and you're doing it in very, very small batches. So the reason for the discrepancy of the blue in the Book of Kells is the size of the batch they had to make it in, and they're just going around doing bit by bit, and I've literally come up with exactly the same problem in the same place. And sort of trying to follow what they're doing, but really that is just what happens when you use that technique. So I'm quite convinced that that is evidence of that technique in practice. So the chemistry matches because it's woad with gypsum, and also the little tool marks, the little habits of the craftsman that made it match. So that's why I'm quite confident that this is how blue works in Kells. Now you can see here from two other gospel book examples that this recipe for blue didn't get out to everybody. And it's a strange quirk of insular manuscripts that most of them avoid blue, they just don't do it. And that's because out of the 48 examples I showed earlier of the blue, 47 of those are terrible. They handle really, really badly, they're really grainy, and they make a really dull blue. And whoever made the Cadmog Gospels, they've had that problem. They've not understood the chemistry, so they've got this kind of dull slate, grey kind of blue. They might have even just tried to work with straight woad. So they know what the pigment is, no one's told them the recipe. Book of Dima, on the other hand, they've got the recipe. And you can see this throughout the insular gospel books, who's in the conversation on blue and who isn't. And it's, I think, quite an interesting way to see lines of communication. So, for example, Lindisfarne Gospels, they've got the really good blue. Book of Kells have the really good blue. There's lots of lines of communication you can draw between the two in that culture, that they are definitely, with some people in between through the generations, a line of communication of craftsmen passing on specific sets of skills that go together, whereas there's some outliers that know about the blue, sort of know what to do, but they clearly haven't been told the recipe, because otherwise they wouldn't have done it like that. So we're going to lead. Now, lead's quite simple, but it's just a good example of how precise they had to be and the sort of chemical knowledge they had. So really it's just sheet lead buried in horse manure and vinegar for 4 months. That's in the top corner underneath that. That's what happens after the 4 months. It's become lead carbonate. You then heat the lead carbonate in a fire to get lead oxide and lead tetroxide. And this is the equation for that. Now, the interesting part of the equation is at the bottom, if you see the 470 degrees to 500 degrees. That's your temperature window. And that's actually really, really difficult to hit. So that takes some skill. And almost every insular manuscript that has anyone that has any color in it has lead in it. So this is a pretty widespread industrial process that anyone involved with insular manuscripts is at a site where this is happening. And it's not easy. It really isn't easy at all. So there's a theory that it was done on the side of kilns and other industrial processes where you have to have a consistent temperature. But it does just go to show the level of skill to hit that 30 degrees in a fire. Because high temperature stuff, really, really easy. Just keep making it hotter, you get a result. This, if you get to 470, you get your result. But if you go over 500, it turns yellow again. So you lose it. So it's really, really difficult to control that. And now we'll go on to what I think is oak bark ink. And I'll make the case for that now. Basically, it's visually indistinguishable from oak gall ink. Can't tell the difference. Chemically, it's almost identical. It's using quercetanic acid from the bark rather than gallic acid from the oak gall. And the archaeological evidence puts oak bark tanned leather at most insular monastic sites. It's the general stuff that turns up in a ditch, bits of shoes and offcuts and things like that are bark tanned. So it means there was a big vat of oak bark somewhere near that monastery, and you only need a little bit of it to make ink. So why would you go to this effort for oak gall ink? It just doesn't seem to make sense to me. This is my copy of a part of the Book of Kells, getting analysed by Raman Spectrography, Durham. And this is the result of that. Now, this is just one I picked off the internet for oak gall ink because I didn't get my graph results back soon enough to put into this talk. But the fact is, it doesn't matter because oak gall ink and oak bark ink both give exactly the same curve. They are completely indistinguishable. So every medieval manuscript which has been analysed and comes up with a little graph like that, and is therefore called oak gall ink, could equally be oak bark ink. So it's a 50-50 chance if all other things remain equal. But all other things aren't equal. The oak gall wasp was only introduced to the UK in the 1830s. from the Levant. It couldn't have survived in the UK before 1735, when Cape Goldie Brown started landscaping and bringing in the turkey oaks, because they need that for a year of their life cycle. Some other galls are available. They were all introduced much later than that, right into the 1960s. So really, oak gall ink just doesn't make sense. There's no early sources that mention it. If they got it, it's quite a trade route. It would have been quite expensive, and it's no better and no different to a perfectly good local resource, which is cheap and is essentially the same thing. So I am completely against the concept of oak gall ink in insular manuscripts. So move on to the purple now. This is quite a nice one. It's one of these ones that before the research was done, again at Trinity, it was up in the air. It was thought that Tyrian purple may be the purple in insular manuscripts. It's comes from, there's Mediterranean snails that make it, but locally dog whelks are the source. They've still got the same little gland. You don't get a lot, but it's there. It's a light, fast purple. And the other contender is orson from the cudbear lichen and some other lichen species. And the issue, when it was discovered and analysed, orson wins. And from doing practical experiments on this, there's a reason for that. This is a jar of orson and some parchment with some dog whelk dye on it. And I did about the same amount of work to get each of those amounts. So that was about 15, 20 minutes work. I've got a jar of orson there that will last me the rest of my life. I will never empty that jar making manuscripts. That is really, really potent stuff. You don't need much in a manuscript. That's me done. For all that work on dog whelks, I might get one letter coloured in. It is dramatically more work, dramatically more difficult to work with, harder to process. It's just not worth it. Another example of why the lichen dye is much preferable is, as a universal indicator, you can get a range of tones out of it. So if you see in this close-up of the Rosemarkie Gospels, there's one I made for Grtoam House Museum, both the sort of more indigo purple and the lighter tone, they're both from the same dye. I've just added vinegar to one, and I think I added lime to the other one. But anyway, an acid and an alkali, and you get two colours out of it. So two for the price of one of what is a very, very cheap, easy process. So now on to geometry, which is sort of you can't avoid it. Not everybody likes it, but when it gets to insular manuscripts, it's just something you have to deal with. It's a big, big part of it. Just get a drink. So this is a image was shared with me by Victoria Thompson when I was talking to her about the nature of geometry and the specific issue around Unit 1. As in insular manuscripts, everything's very precise, it's very exact, but the first move they make on a page, particularly for artwork, seems to be complete random. There's no rhyme or reason to it, there's no consistency, even within manuscripts. There's no regular unit. They just set out dividers at a certain distance, and that seems almost random. Just anything roughly in the space will do. Then they work from there, and from there on to pure precision. And this little picture of God's hand coming out of the sky, the set of dividers, and just going, that sums it up. And this is another way it's summed up in Irish culture, is the story of Macanca and Cuchulainn. So basically, Cuchulainn was a warrior, wasn't very nice, and he went to Macanca, the craftsman, and threatened him to make a shield for him. And what he specifically said was, I want you to make a shield different and better than everyone else's. Now, Macanca had already made everybody else's shields, and he'd run out of ideas. So he was very depressed about it. And to summarise what happens, he meets this wee fella called Dubdeha and tells him what's going on. So Dubdeha says to him, go home, cover your floor with ashes, and it'll all work out. So that's what he does. Then the wee man comes down through his roof with a forked point and scribes out the design on the floor for him, thus giving him the inspiration to make the shield. And that's just a really neat way, yet again, of where does this Unit 1 come from? And that's just one example of several stories. There's ones involving angels. There's various ones that they deal with this unit ones, this confusion that there is on what's the first thing you do, what we might call the moment of inspiration. They deal with that, and they have myths for it, and it maybe goes some way to explain what's going on, but it's still, to modernize, quite unnerving to start something that's all based on mass and precision, and yet unit one, literally out of the sky. But it does seem to be that they were content with that narrative that it practically is out of the sky. So speaking of unit one, probably the best example in insular art, certainly the most overt, has to be the Rosemarkie stone. And that's because on this stone, what's called the V-rod is that forked point that comes out of the sky. It is the dividers set at unit one for that stone. Now, I'm not getting into meanings of Pictish stones and all the many other things it could be, but one of the things this artist has used it for is to convey unit one, and that can be demonstrated quite clearly as a piece of coherent geometry. So this little video, the longer version, I think is on the Grtoam House website, that shows both sides of the stone. But basically, all I need here to reconstruct the design of that stone is unit one that leads towards two circles. Those two circles are the two arcs that make what's called the Pictish crescent in this case. And all you need is unit one, and all you need is sort of know where you're going, and all the information is within that symbol to make that entire stone both sides. Now, in this example, I've just done it to its sort of the bare bones of it, but the entire design, right down to the fine details, is pure geometry. There is not a thing on that stone. I think some bits are quite worn, but certainly as far as you can take that stone, it's pure geometry. And it is exactly the geometry given to you by that forked point, which is the V-rod, which may be what comes out of the sky. We don't know where that particular picture got it from, but that's how they've treated it. That is unit one. And what that tells you is that stone is very precisely something. Don't know what, but they're really going out of their way to tell you and communicate, even more so than in any other piece of insular art. They want you to know how this was done and exactly what it is. And it's for a public audience, so they expected people to understand that. And that's probably why in this stone the geometry is much more obviously explained than it is within any manuscript. You might have to have a certain level of learning or status to see a manuscript, whereas this is for everybody. And presumably, this is, as far as being obvious goes, this is as far as they take it. So get on to the next. So here, just taken out of it is the V-rod and crescent symbol. So I've just extracted that from it, just so you can see how little you really need to make that whole stone. And within that, the green V-rod is unit one. The two circles are essentially design the whole stone. They all hang, everything in the stone hangs off the repeats of those circles, and you don't need anything else. That is it. You could even possibly interpret it further. Tentatively, you could say you need 7 of the smaller circles and 3 of the bigger ones. And if you see within the Z-rod, there's a grouping of 7 and a grouping of 3. That doesn't explain the other grouping of 7, but it's quite clear that one of the layers of meaning in this stone is to make it clear how the stone works, so you can navigate your way around it. That is crystal clear, even just on a perspective of being a craftsman, having to make something. This comes with its own instruction set, very, very clearly. So on to other bits of geometry. Now I'm working my way back to Kells here slowly, but it's easier to go through these. So this is Echternach, and what it tells you basically is that you can sort of get rid of all the other bits of insular art. You don't need key patterns, you don't need knotwork and panels and all the rest of it. When it comes down to it, when insular art is stripped back to what they really care about, it's the geometry. That's what they're going for. Here we have the floor plan of Nendrum Church, and also a portrait from the Book of Kells, and basically they're exactly the same design. So whether you're trying to stick the door in at a church or have the angel's halo coming out of a frame, the process is identical. It's exactly the same working process. So it just sort of goes to show how ingrained the geometric way of thinking is in not just the insular art, but just the practical ways of being an insular person making stuff in their world, that you always go back to geometry. So following along in Echternach now, this page is really, really interesting, and I put it in every talk, and I sort of change what I think about it every time slightly. So on the left, we have the design for the outer frame. And the outer rectangle is basically, for any manuscript page, that's what you're making first. the general way through then is to just hang your design off those marks you've made to get your outer rectangle. So you'll just work on that ratio, refine it down, do your design within it, and away you go. The strange thing about this page is they didn't do that. And you can see here on the right, I've done all the working marks you need to get these bits on the inside of it. And you think, well, that's only 4 squares and a couple of little L shapes sticking out. Why is there all this heavy engineering? Why would you bother? You could easily have done something very similar to that without putting all that work into it. That doesn't seem to make sense. And one thing that's erroneously said about this design is that it has rotational symmetry. Just to prove that it doesn't, this is 2 tracings of that outline on top of each other. This is the same with one of the tracings turned round. So you can see, obviously we see the red and the blue, that's where they don't match. Now this might not look like much, but this is enough. Integral artists do not make mistakes this size. So you can disregard that this is a mistake. Yet it's enough to sort of trick your brain to thinking on the first, that's nearly rotational symmetry, but not quite. And it's a little bit confusing because your brain wants to see rotational symmetry there, but it's not there. So they're trying to trick you, basically. What is actually there, and this is from Robert Stevick, this diagram, he has explained, he sort of explained this page. He's explained it very well, but unfortunately he's just turned it into maths. So he understands it brilliantly. It's a wonderful explanation, but it's impenetrable. It's nearly as impenetrable as the original. But what he demonstrates here is that all the internal lines of this image are actually the square root of 2. So that's another insular ratio. So the outer ratio that we looked at is based on phi, doesn't match the inner ratios, and that's really, really unusual and also really difficult to achieve, and you really have to know what you're doing to do that. And what that does, and also with the offset of the symmetry, it actually makes it almost like a visual riddle. Because we're people that aren't really that geometrically sensitive. We deal with measurement. We can say what everything is in feet and inches or centimeters. That's our way of navigating. For people really familiar with a world made up of geometric sequences, all your buildings, of geometric floor plans, your objects, your art objects, it's everywhere. These are 2 of your most common ratios that don't really mix, yet this guy's mixed them. And it really throws you off because you think you're seeing one thing, then you think you're seeing another thing. And then there's this almost rotational symmetry, which again throws you off. It's quite a disorientating image. And when you put it all together, this is how I think it works. I think that the disorientation on this page that you see first on the left, with then the lion that kind of guides your eye over to the gospel, is deliberate. Instead of making you sort of worship the gospel through all the imagery and being hit by color, they're sort of playing a little magic eye trick and a little bit of confusion. They're basically getting conscious thought out of your head so that when the lion guides your eye over to the perfect rotational symmetry of a nitium, you're straight taken into the gospel and you're sort of reading and absorbing the gospel without any conscious thought in your mind before you realize you're doing it. Which is a sort of, it's a way of getting you to focus on it. And I think that's the tactic. And this whole book's almost like a joke that leads up to that, because the other pages do have rotational symmetry. So you really expect it. You really don't expect this image to do what it does. It really is an outlier, but it's like the whole book is set up to just for that moment. And it's, there's a lot of work put into that. That is not an easy thing to do. It's quite hard even to copy, but to conceive of that, to design it, to take out the right lines just out of that confusion in the right place, that is serious, serious engineering. So moving on to Kells. Kells gets a bit of a bad rap geometrically. One of the reasons is the only pages that have really been analysed by academics as geometric are the ones that have a full rectangle border. And that isn't the case. They're all geometric, particularly the incipits. It's a bit harder to find the rectangle, basically. Now, in this case, what they've done, and they do this in Lindisfarne as well, the incipits, is where I've marked in the blue arrows, that's your unit 1, and the red arrows, that's what gives you a ratio. So it's dividing unit 1 by the longer one, that gives you your ratio. So in the Book of Kells, where they don't give you a full rectangle, what they'll do sometimes is these little border cut-ins, and that's to tell you where unit 1 is. So they want you to know. I've also put a little star in the design, and that is the pupil of the little guy with the book. And again, that's another thing that turns up quite often in manuscripts, that something really crucial geometrically will be happening, right where the pupil goes. And that's often either a compass move or the end of a very important line. So, this is beyond coincidence. They're definitely trying to help you work out the geometry. They want you to see it and navigate the image in some way using geometry. But basically, I haven't got a clue what that is. The geometry is helpful in a practical way for designing it. When you design the page, you obviously know your way around it, and you can see there's many clues in there wanting you to see the geometry. But as to why they go to this trouble and what the reasoning could be, basically, I'm not sure. I just know I'm far enough into this to know I have to do it. And if you see on the design, everything I've marked in red is what comes up in the final design. I haven't gone any further for simplicity, but basically that whole sweeping L, the I completely, the B, all of that is pure geometry. I doubt there is a freehand line in that other than the two human figures. One of the reasons for that is you cannot do a big ink curve, particularly that curve on the L. Your hand just can't do that in one go. The pen wouldn't even hold enough ink to get round that far and that thick. These have to be done with pivots. And that means you have to constantly divide up arcs that join perfectly, which means you need really, really precise geometry and to know where you're putting your compass, and then usually as well to hide where the compass has been. So this is a serious bit of work to do this geometry. And there's no way of cutting corners on this, but they're not doing it just as draftsmanship. They want you to know. They're putting information in there to tell you that, but yeah, I don't know what it is or why. This is the equation extracted from that page. I have difficulties with these equations. I don't usually put things into it because it doesn't mean much to me. Like as compass moves, I'm comfortable with it. Even as lines, I'm all right. As equations, it doesn't. The thing to point out about this equation is that it unifies phi in the square root of 2, which is exactly what happens in Ecternap. So that puts Kells into this pretty high-level group because not many manuscripts do that. That really is the high-level stuff that gets people that really know their maths excited. I can't deal with these equations very easily, but this geometry expressed in those terms suggests that Kells is actually geometrically high-end in every other way, but geometrically it's high-end, but they're putting it in the incipits where unless you go through it and design it, it's hard to see that there's a rectangle there to get the ratios from, but they are there. This is the practical need for geometry. This S-bend on the N in initium, those are two approximate Euclid spirals. Each one has multiple borders, and it's basically a load of arcs joined together. So just in that S-bend with the little circle in the middle, that's probably got about 100 component parts in it, just for the outline. And I'm terrible at videoing these. You would need like something David Attenborough has out of Frozen Planet to do like little microscopic cameraman work. But basically, I end up videoing the back of my head because I forget. I get absorbed into it and forget that the camera's there. And anyway, you need to get really close. So this is sort of, if you can see right by hand, this is putting together that. But just to get the idea across that for the really, really tiny detail stuff, all the curves have to be marked out geometrically. And then it means when you get into that really, really tight stuff, particularly with the quill, you don't really have sideways movements so much in that scale. It's forward and back. You're making really simple movements in a really precise space. And this is where all that geometric step-by-step really gets you into that space for really precise movements. If you were freehand drawing that on any level, by now your margin of error would be into millimeters, which in that would be massive. It would be all over the place. It's just not possible. Oh, and we're pretty much at the end. Oh, that's all right, just under an hour. So this is what I'm planning to do next and what I'm doing through Kickstarter. This is the first page I want to tackle in a project to basically make more of the Book of Kells and take everything I do further. So answer questions more directly, take everything back to its absolute basic principles. Is this exactly what they did? Try it. If it isn't, tweak it. So I picked this page because it's got all the pigments in it. It's got a very interesting use of blue, which I've not experimented with, where I've got the purple and the blue. I don't know how that works. I want to know. For the evangelist symbols, they're quite similar to a lot of Pictish sculpture. And obviously we're a bit image drenched. You can just Google stuff and check stuff. I want to see what happens if you try to either construct these animals from life or from existing sculpture. What are the component parts? How do you go about it? So this is my project that I'm raising funds for. It starts from £5 to follow it, right up to buying copies of the Book of Kells. And it's a way to fund this research. It doesn't really fit within any academic camp. And according to Creative Scotland, I work in heritage, and according to the Heritage Lottery, I'm an artist. So there's problems with funding for these things. Somebody even suggested I was stealing copyright by making a copy. But I think it's worth doing, so I'm going to pursue it. And that's pretty much the end. So I think we're ready for questions if anybody's got any. Better stop screen sharing.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Well, there's only one way I can describe that, which is mind-blowing. The breadth and depth of your research and thinking is just absolutely awe-inspiring to me anyway. So thank you so much. We do have questions. So first off, from Alex, would they have been using a preliminary drawing to figure out how best to situate the page on the hide, maybe tucked behind the translucency of the hide to figure out the best placement?
Yes, most likely something like that. Yeah, I suspect they might have even had like a little frame with strings on it, because the one thing is for the text, that's consistent the whole way throughout. So you could make one frame that you could constantly use over and over again. So I suspect I've done some experiments with it, and I suspect something like strings set out so you can easily move it around and see the holes and see the blemishes and work out the best place to put it.
Rand, thank you. Next from Dawn Burgoyne, bark ink, is it made the same way as iron gall? And did they mix lamp black into it?
There are carbon-based inks in the Book of Kells, not as many. It's less clear cut. I mean, there's some suggestion that some inks are mixed. I don't really see the point. And I mean, it's not all been tested. It's possible that they weren't even that fussed about using the same pot with different inks. And if you just get a little trace of carbon in it, that'll show up. So I would say they probably didn't mix them, but they definitely used both. And if they did mix, it's an easy accident, because you wouldn't need to clean material or change. You wouldn't clean and change equipment to separate the two inks. So I think that contamination is more likely the reason for a mixing result.
So we have a comment from Guto, which I couldn't agree with more. Absolutely brilliant, fascinating. Thanks. I'll be contributing. Hey. It's a fantastic project. And the results that can come out of this, I think, are just amazing. So Cynthia is also very pleased. Wonderful research, awe-inspiring indeed. Another question now, John Fay. Why do you think they used gypsum when lead white was readily available?
I'm really not sure, because I can't make it behave very well. I suspect they probably have a trick for making it behave better, and we just don't know what it is. That's probably the answer. Certainly for the mixing with woad, that makes sense. But yes, equally, they've got white lead, which is better. So at the moment, I have not got an answer for that at all. I just suspect it's something they know that we don't.
Lots more really very appreciative comments. Another question. In your honest opinion, here, this is a $64,000 one. In your honest opinion, where do you reckon the Book of Kells was made?
Geologically speaking, I don't see how it could be made in a limestone area, because it wouldn't make sense to make the parchment like that. So the answer would be as far away from limestone as possible, which really sticks you in the northeast of Scotland.
Yeah, well, that suits me, but then I'm prejudiced. You're not going to plump for Tarbert versus Rosamaki then?
Oh no, I'll not get into that now.
So Michael Carroll says, curious to know if Port Mahomac had a close source of limestone, and whether that would provide more evidence for Kells being made there.
Portmahon does not have a close source of limestone. I think 80 miles overland on the west coast is their nearest source. So that's, it's quite an effort. But Portmahon has evidence of the seaweed production. So that's the only reason seaweed's even on the table, is because of the evidence of Portmahon. Without Portmahon being there and the evidence for the seaweed production and the Linnell in that size, none of these things would be ideas. They're just so far out there, you just wouldn't come up with it.
And you were saying that the Kells parchment appears to be made using the bacteria process.
Oh, absolutely, definitely.
Yes. So,
there's no doubt from those holes that those are caused by the bacterial process.
Guto again, any thoughts on how one trains these artists and how long such a process would be? Before you start on a manuscript, you'd need a great deal in place.
I'd say very young. But if you think about it, we all went to school and we all know how to write. And that's quite a technical exercise. These are people that take that to the extreme. I was a graffiti writer for many years. That's where I learned my craft of complex letters. And when you're in a culture where the aim and identity is to make complex letters, basically you try really hard and you practice a lot. And a monastic environment is going to be very similar to that. So if you've got motivated young people where your culture values that kind of output, they're going to try really, really hard. And people who are naturally inclined to be artistic are going to have good results. So I think that, they probably had more people focused, certainly as a proportion of their society, a fair few people focused on it. So it's not surprising they got this far. It's just the environment really, really helped, I think.
Fantastic. So another question here. How collaborative is your project? Are you working with other botanical ink makers in local areas? I'm
not working with anybody else making things, but I'm working with lots of scientists who analyze things and speaking to experts and sort of go along step by step, getting the scientific opinion on what's done. That's not because I don't work with people in other areas of life. It's just I think that making these manuscripts is a pretty solitary affair anyway. I think that certainly from the Lindisfarne Gospels, it's one scribe. From Duncan McGowan's research into Kells, it's two scribes. And the fact that you can't just get someone else's ink and use it straight away, particularly for detail stuff. You want to have made that exactly how it handles, exactly what it does, and exact temperature. So you just, you really want to know exactly what you've got. The only way to do that is do it yourself, basically. Even if other people's things are perfectly good, they might not be exactly what you expect in that exact moment. And you just want to understand your materials completely, particularly with all the variables, especially temperature up here.
Good. So, Guto again, not a fair question, he admits, but any thoughts on how such pigments might be transferred to stone?
Yes, because a lot of these pigments would actually make more sense on stone. So such as the discussion around gypsum on stone is a very sensible idea. Woden gypsum on stone would probably work very well. Lead on stone is a brilliant idea, as is orpiment. All of these are minerals that probably suit stone better. If anything, it's almost as if the manuscripts are an afterthought. It's almost as they had a stone workshop, were painting them, then needed to make manuscripts and started adapting a stone-based process. I can't see that if you'd started a manuscript colouring scheme from scratch that you necessarily would have gone in the same direction. It's interesting how late Woad and Orson actually get into manuscripts. It takes a while. I think it's almost Lindisfarne Gospels before they even turn up. And that would suggest that these other things that come from a dyeing craft, are further out, whereas things that come from what would sensibly be on stone sculpture seem to get into the culture really, really quickly. So yeah, definitely a connection.
So there's a future project there to try out these pigments on stone and see how long they last in the outdoors.
Absolutely. I think the next logical step with all the Pictish stones is if you could even find one tiny bit of pigment on one of them, then again you've got something in the ground with pigment. Because if pigments were just made from manuscripts, there's not a hope of finding them anywhere. All the pigments in the Book of Kells you could hold in the palm of one hand easily. So you really need something big to have been painted for there to be any scale of evidence anywhere.
I thought there were was at least one stone that had signs of pigment.
Yes, there's one with some red on it. I don't think it's
Hmm.
been analysed.
All right. Okay. Well, that's
I say at
interesting.
least one. I think there's several with traces, but I don't think the analysis has been done.
Right. Ah, well, we need somebody
I
else.
could be wrong on that, but certainly last time I checked was just some time ago now.
It's going to be a long time before you could turn to that. So we need somebody else taking up this kind of research. um, John Fay says, I've seen you use a very fine cut quill for the detail work on your reproduction instead of a very fine brush. Do you reckon the quill was used for the practically microscopic details or a brush? Apparently, they used pine marten and red squirrel hair for their brushes.
Yes, I have made a pine marten brush. Basically, I'm not very good at making brushes, is the short on that. I spoke to Joseph Batley, who made some very, very convincing reproductions of the small spirals. He is now convinced by the brush method, and haven't seen what he's done with it. That has swayed me. So, yes, I have been using a quill. I am now reconsidering to go to brush, having seen Joseph Batley. So, basically, I'm not sure. There's a possibility it would be both, because I think that for instance, for colouring in tiny little triangles within a very tiny circle, the pull of the quill pokes into the corners better than a brush. So I think it's probably a case of mix and match. But certainly from seeing Joseph Batley's recent work, which he's put on YouTube, I am much more taken with brush now. So it is something I'm going to be looking closely at again. But I was towards quill, but now having seen what's been done, I'm swaying back to brush again. But basically, I don't
know. Guto likes the Greek graffiti analogy. On what material might monastic novices be practicing their skills? Wax tablets are not precise enough. Parchment is expensive.
Slate, probably. There's been some discovered in Bangor. There's a few samples from there. I think there's been some that are a bit later, discovered somewhere in Scotland. The place doesn't spring to mind, but certainly in several places, slate offcuts have been found with motifs on them. Nothing you could really call a working design for a manuscript, but I would say that's probably what it was. And also, there's a certain amount of waste from parchment making, and not very good parchment. The idea that all parchment was very expensive, I don't really think stands up to reason. I mean, the Irish economy is, if anything, overproducing calves at this period. They've got a cattle loan system that involves everybody essentially lending cattle to each other, and there's quite an incentive to overproduce. Then you can't feed them in winter, so you got to kill a load. So I don't think they would have been short of skins, and you can make not very good parchment quite easily. So I think there would be enough offcuts going around and skins that didn't quite make it within a monastic community that anybody reasonably competent would get a bit of parchment to work on. I don't think it's as rare as is sometimes alluded to.
All right. And a plea from Guto. Will you please work with a sculptor to recreate a coloured Nig cross slab?
Yeah, I'm on for looking at that, definitely.
We need David McGovern. Right. Donica says, do you have evidence to suggest the vellum was made as the work progressed, rather than being assembled before the work of writing and illuminating was begun?
As in a smoking gun of archaeological evidence? No, just by the sense of how you put a manuscript together. Yes, you don't really want, particularly without heating and climate, control of your environment, you don't want to make a big pile of parchment and leave it just sitting there, because it's not good. And also the amount in the Book of Kells, that's years worth of production. So you wouldn't commission a book 10 years ahead and then not start it until you've got all the parchment. It just doesn't make sense. You really want parchment either on the frame or bound in the book. You want to minimize those in-between bits. So even if it's not strictly bound, you'd want it in its little leather casing, its little book satchel. When that's not out and about, that would probably be clamped in some way. So just for how parchment behaves and just the sensibilities of the tools and how you work, you're drip feeding the parchment in, because again, some of ththese pages are taking 8-9 weeks. So why would you wait for all the parchment to arrive when you could get started and parchment will keep coming?
A comment from Guto. Yeah, I listened to a lecture on Welsh castles recently. They have been able to identify pigments in the soil at the bottom of internal walls, identifying imported materials.
Wow.
You were definitely saying that
Yeah, got to get to the bottom of some picture stones that are still sitting there.
imports definitely necessary. Now, Alana says, and I think you can comment on this, I know that you didn't touch upon it, but what type of materials would have been used to bind the book? I'm pretty sure you've done research into binding as well, haven't you?
To an extent, yeah. So certainly oak boards for the outside. The string, probably linen in an Irish context. Then you're on to that's the nuts and bolts of a binding. The leather, probably a tanned leather. I think the Cuthbert Gospel is the only sort of original binding that exists, and that is the example essentially. And I think for relatively simple books, that's probably the format. For a complex thing, the Book of Kells that had its jeweled binding stone in 1007. Well, not brilliantly described, but going by the book, probably gold, probably jewels. That has to sit in something heavy, probably oak boards, I think.
A general question from Alex: will this recording be available to view again? Yes, it will, via the museum website. Could manuscript makers have learned from tattoos? Asks David.
Short answer, I don't know, because you'd have to have the example of the tattoo that predated the manuscript. Just because bodies aren't flat, I think that will be more difficult. So I think coherent geometry has to emerge on something more controllable on a body before it ends up on it. But again, I'm not a tattoo artist, so I just don't know.
Catherine Forsyth comments, slates with trial motifs excavated at Inchmarnock and at St. Blaine's, both on Butte.
I'll have to check those out, because that sounds like what they would have been doing. That seems the obvious thing to do.
Michael Carroll says, I tend to compose with coherent geometry and then make freehand adjustments, taking advantage of the ability to scrape back inked lines to refine curves and correct mistakes. Do you find the same to be true?
In my own work, yes. When copying from Kells, it's frustrating how little there is in that kind of leeway. Because if they scraped backwards, you can get away with it on a bit of vellum to keep clean. On an old book or bits of vellum I have scraped back and then just not treated particularly well, it collects dirt and you would see it, and you just don't see it in Kells. But yeah, for my own work, scraping back, making mistakes, the odd bit of freehand, yes, that all happens. But when I'm strictly trying to reproduce what's in front of me from the originals, the terrifying thing is that for these higher end manuscripts, mistakes don't make a big part of it. It's quite worrying how few mistakes there are.
Well, we've come to the end of questions, so everybody, yes, the recording will be available, I think, under events on Grtoam House's website. Once Doug has put it there, anyway. So an opportunity to look again, highly necessary, really. I mean, you covered so much ground in so much detail that I should certainly want to watch this again. So, well, just thank you. Thanks a million, literally. That's been an enthralling and fascinating evening. Always is. Whenever you talk about this stuff, I'm just mind-blowing. Thank you, Thomas.
Thanks very much.